Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Biggleswade Town Council. I'd like to inform everyone that this meeting will be filmed and live streamed to YouTube. By your presence, you're deemed to have consented to be filmed and to the use of those images and sound recordings. Can I please request that when councillors and members of the public are speaking, not to disclose any personal information of an individual, as this might infringe the rights of that individual and breach data protection rules. This is a formal town council meeting and members of the public will be given the opportunity to speak during public open sessions, but will not be permitted to speak at other times. Thank you. We have apologies for absence from councillors Ramsey and North. Declarations of interest, please. Councillor Strawn.
A non-pecuniary interest in item 16A.
Any other declarations? I have a declaration, a non-pecuniary in item 11K. So I'm moving on to Town Mayor's announcements. And the first thing I'd like to do is to wish everyone a happy, healthy and peaceful new year. And then to record that I attended the Biggleswade Choral Society Christmas concert at St Andrew's Church on the 18th of December. It was a lovely way to get into the Christmas spirit with good music and opportunities for audience participation. I now move on to the public open session. We have no members in the chamber. Are there any members of the public online? Are they indicating to speak? Please indicate if you wish to speak. No? Okay, so I'm moving rapidly on. And the next item is our invited speaker. And I'd very much like to welcome Charlotte Gurney from Central Bedfordshire Council. She's the head of the Housing Solutions Department. And Charlotte, we asked as a council if you could come along and explain to us a bit more about the changes to the housing allocation that are being consulted on at the moment, so that we understand a bit more about what the issues are.
So, hello everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me along this evening. So yeah, I'm the head of Housing Solutions, which basically means I lead on all housing issues that are anything to do with housing, but not council housing. And by that I mean not our own council housing. So one of those things is obviously the housing register and people trying to access, and that's what the allocation scheme is about. So the allocation scheme for Central Bedfordshire was adopted in 2014, so it's quite out of date if you think of a lot of things that have happened, particularly with the pandemic, and there has been a lot of new guidance over the last 2 years. I think the last bit was actually released in December, so you know there's been lots of changes in what they want us to consider to what is suitable for when you're allocating a property to an individual. We started the review of the allocation scheme actually pre-2020, and by doing that we spoke to all of our frontline officers, people that had been through trying to access social housing, but also the registered providers, of which there are about 27 other registered providers across Central Bedfordshire. So it's not just the council that provide houses, you've got lots of housing associations, both private and sort of charity based. From that, we just sort of put together a list of the themes that were causing problems or issues for people while trying to access housing. Now, there's a piece of legislation for the Housing Act 96, which dictates that every local authority must have an allocation scheme. But unlike other strategies and policies that the council has, the allocation scheme is more of a procedural document. So it also dictates how you will verify somebody's application and how you will decide if they qualify for social housing. And I think the reason for that procedural side of it is that really if a member of the public wants to look at it, they should be able to determine if they're going to qualify before they apply, and also what will happen after they apply, i.e. what sort of documents they're going to have to provide us, how long that's going to take, how they can challenge the decision if they don't agree with it, and then how they would actually get allocated the property. So we sort of started that work, and there's obviously lots of confusion for some people. I will not say that the allocation scheme is the easiest thing in the world to understand, and that's because it is still a statutory piece of legislation, and therefore, even though a member of the public could read it, I probably would recommend that it's not the best bit of reading for a member of the public to go ahead with. But it is it does need to be clearer. It does need to really look at how we band priority. And overall, it's just supposed to be a fair and transparent scheme that will really look at prioritising a property for the person most in need. So the changes that we've come up with are really just 4 main themes, but there are lots of changes within those themes. So if I just sort of talk a bit to each one, and I'm happy to take any questions at the end. So the first one, we've called the theme Helping Vulnerable People and Families. The idea behind it is that we want to try and minimise the time that somebody might stay in transitional accommodation when they become homeless. At the moment, it's about 26 weeks that a household would have to stay in TA. And even though that is actually deemed as quite good, if you look at local authority figures, that's still 6 months of somebody's life where they are homeless, where they haven't got a root base, where children's education could be affected, where their access to GPs could be affected. Temporary accommodation is not always near your local support networks or near your family, you know, it's where the temporary accommodation is. So we want to try and do that quicker, where we can allocate properties to people that are homeless in a quicker way. And what we've also done to look at that is looked at what we've called an emergency banding. So there are, unfortunately, often situations where people are at risk in their current home, and that might be because they've decided to work with the police around issues that are in the local area or things that they've seen. It could be that they've been a victim of harassment or domestic abuse and their perpetrator knows where they are. And what we want to really do is make sure that that person isn't having to apply for housing, start bidding for a choice-based letting system to get the property they want. I mean, they are at risk. What we need to do is just be moving that person as quick as we can into an area where they're safe, into a property that's suitable for their needs. So that was the first sort of thing we looked at, and how we could speed that up for those sort of vulnerable households. The second thing we've looked at is we've just called it One Housing Register, One Allocation Scheme. So accidentally, and I will say it was accidentally because I was around in 2014, there was sort of discretion put to older people that wanted to apply for the housing register. Now, please don't anyone take offence at this, but the housing register deems older people to be above the age of 50. It is not very old, I know, but that's where it is. And I think the reasons for that are around independent living. But what it meant was that older people were allowed to access the register, even if they were homeowners, even if they had higher savings. And that was because there was a lot of what was deemed as older person accommodation across the area. And our register providers were nervous that they would not be able to let those properties unless we were a bit more, I don't know, yeah, just a bit easier on how those people could access. What happened then was that we had the housing register, and then we sort of gained this older persons register that are people that wouldn't qualify usually for housing, but do qualify for older persons accommodation. And the Queen could apply to the housing register and qualify for older persons accommodation. It's a little bit too loose, I would say, around who could come and access housing. And so we're saying that's not right. You know, that what we can do is look at the discretion that we give to older people and maybe give them, you know, higher income savings they could have. Maybe, of course, they could have higher savings themselves because they're not going to be adding to those savings over time. That's stuff they've earned from their, you know, their lifetime. But really, should they just be able to have absolutely anything and access social housing? If we've got an abundance of social housing for older people, it would be better for us to be looking at how that could be repurposed, you know, and not just leave it for older people that don't need it, maybe. So what we want to do is get rid of that, put income and saving thresholds in, just make it a bit tighter around who's accessing for when they're older. The third thing was around making fair assessment. So I would say that again, residents of Central Bedfordshire should always be prioritised above others. So I don't know if anyone knows what reasonable preference means, but the housing legislation says that people in reasonable preference must always be given access to a housing register. That's homeless households, that could be people fleeing domestic abuse. You know, there's a sort of list of people that are overcrowded. Well, that reasonable preference applies for anyone nationally. But if we let absolutely everybody that was that reasonable preference into our housing register, then they might qualify above our own residents. And so what we're saying is, of course, we will do what we need to with reasonable preference, but our own residents should just be slightly prioritised, that's above. So there's a local connection criteria, residency criteria, but there's lots of changes that have happened, and we just need to make sure we're meeting the national guidance that's come out, as well as the legislation still, but being able to prioritise our own. So it's just a little bit of more transparency around letting people onto the register when they come from out of area. And then the final theme was around just making sure that we strengthen that priority when people are accessing. So we wanted to create a band 4. Now there are bandings within our housing allocation scheme, and the purpose of 2014 was to just cut them down, just have 2 bands. Everyone is either like band 1 or they're band 2. So they're either an emergency or they can just bid against everybody else. And it's just not practical, because there's so many, there's so many different grey and white, and, when you're looking at properties. So we just want to increase that banding, ensure that people in central Bedfordshire get priority, but just sort of make it more. So the band 4 is a proposal to get those people from outside of area will always be able to access, but in a band 4, and then ours will be above. What comes with that then is us introducing local lettings policies. So we've had versions of local lettings policies, but not in the way that the legislative guidance was in place. So we've got a rural exception scheme. And that means that sometimes when properties are built in certain rural areas, the discussions that will be had through our housing strategy colleagues and through development, building control, that will become a rural exception scheme. It means it's prioritised for people within that local area. Well, we want to expand that a little bit more, and rather than just have it for those new developments, maybe sometimes we would see the need, by working with people like yourselves, for there to be a local lettings policy within a specific area. Now that could be used to tackle antisocial behaviour, maybe it could be used to tackle something else within that area. It could be because there are a certain cohort of people that are really struggling to access housing, and maybe we want to prioritise that cohort. So we want to use local lettings policies a lot more. What's come out with this draft allocation scheme is actually a local lettings policy draft for SP1 sites. So for those of you that know about that, it's to do with our local plan. And within the local plan, there was a number of properties over the next 20 years that are put aside to help Luton Borough Council with their housing need. And it's not that we will be allocating just to people from Luton Borough Council, it's just that we would then be building more affordable homes that can be sold on the open market as affordable homes. But we would be building more than what our housing need is. We're also building some that would cover some of theirs, as all their other neighbouring authorities are. And it's just because they are landlocked. But what we wanted to make sure was that we weren't just allocating portions of housing to people from Luton Borough Council. We already meet reasonable preference category of people from Luton, and what I'm able to show, or what I have been able to show over the last 5 years, is as I've been doing that, the number of households that I might have to accommodate, we are already doing that. So there's no change at all. We should just be able to carry on as we are with these reasonable preference categories in place, and we wouldn't have to do anything else. But obviously we have a local lettings plan for, if for some reason we suddenly don't meet the numbers that we've deemed to under the local plan, we would be able to trigger this to be able to prioritise some households from Luton if we needed to meet their need. So it's explained within the local lettings policy. We do refer to it as a backstop device because we don't believe we'll ever need to trigger it. But there's no reason why it shouldn't be there. I think it gives everyone the assurance that we are doing what we need to do. So the current consultation is due to end within about a week's time, but actually we've given Biggleswade Town Council till the end of the month to provide their feedback, and that's because I'm only here to talk to you tonight, so a week is quite a quick turnaround if anyone's got any thoughts or wants to ask questions on it. So even though it's officially closing, it's okay for you to submit your thoughts and feelings on it by the end of the month. So I suppose I just need to say that the housing allocation scheme is important in the sense that it is just about us prioritising our scarce resource and making sure that it's allocated to the right people. The demand for housing feeds into where properties might be built, but the allocation scheme is actually something that comes after those properties are built. This is about who gets them once they're already in place. So yeah, if anyone's got any specific questions, then I am happy to take them.
Could I just ask straight away then, do you have input into what goes into the local plan about housing numbers to meet your needs for your clients?
So with the local plan, and actually with any planning application that comes in, I'm able to feed into whether or not there is demand in that area for that. So part of a housing register application would say to somebody, where do you want to live? And they would give it as a first choice. And then if there are any other areas, you know, is there any other areas you would consider? And we separate Central Bedfordshire into 12 housing areas. That's just how we then are able to work it out. People give their preferences, and I'm able to then say, yep, I've got this many households that are showing a preference for this area, either as their number one choice or just they would move there if they needed to. And I think in general, we get about 120 housing applications every week, and about 50% of those qualify. So if 60 people are qualifying for a housing register every week, and yet some weeks we get 10 properties that are available. And, you know, this isn't just now, this has been the case for years. So you can see as time goes on, we're falling more and more out of sync with being able to meet that need. So yes, I do feed into it, but it's more around the demand in that area and the property types. So if I'm seeing a housing application for lots of 4 or 5 bed detached houses, and I know the demand is 1 and 2 beds, I would be saying this is not something that area is needing at this time.
Okay, thank you. Colleagues. Councillor Strawn.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Very interesting presentation. A couple of questions I've got for you. You mentioned particularly the vulnerable, at risk and homeless, so to speak, and the transition phase, which takes approximately 26 weeks. Now, is it correct that CBC have been habitually sending residents of central CBC area out to Luton and elsewhere for transition relief, so to speak? Why is that? Why can't we provide it in central beds if that is the case? Or if it used to be the case, has it stopped and will it stop? And secondly, you also mentioned priority to CBC residents. One also hears anecdotally, and it may not be correct, that we have in Biggleswade in particular had quite a number of families coming from outside Central Bedfordshire into housing association accommodation, which in view of what you're stating should in fact be reserved for CBC residents in the first place. I appreciate your observations.
Well,
issue with our internet as well, so
Wi-Fi.
I don't know. What do people think? Do we carry on with the meeting or do we stop? Crack on. Okay, please, Charlotte.
So thank you. So first question, transitional accommodation, and do we or have we put people outside of the area for TA? I suppose the first answer to that would be yes, we did. And secondly, no, we don't now, apart from the TA that we own outside of the area. So over the last 4 years, we've had a really strong acquisition programme, and part of that has been around making sure that we own TA within all the different areas of Central Bedfordshire. As a unitary authority, when we were formed back in 2009, the only housing stock we had was South Beds District Council housing stock, which means everything was in the south of the area. So we had absolutely no TA over in the north, and really only in the last 4 years is where we've been buying buildings and repurposing them. And I would say the Sandy Hotel was an example of that, where we've repurposed it to use as TA for families. We've also purchased lots of, we call them satellite properties, but I just mean houses or flats within different areas to try and meet the TA needs in that area. Now, until we'd done that for each area, we were sending people anywhere that we could get properties. And that's usually from using private lets, like nightly lets. We were using B&B, we were using hotels. Yes, that was definitely in Luton, but it was sometimes as far away as Rochester, or it was anywhere that we could get it. In 2019, we'd managed to purchase enough that we were able to stop using hotels and B&Bs. We only managed to stop using nightly lets in July last year. So it was a great achievement because we'd been trying to get there for ages, but it was July last year where we only used the accommodation we owned. Now, what we own outside of area, and there's a really good reason for owning it outside of area, is 4 one-bed flats. And we own an old hotel in Luton, which has 16 units in it. Now, the reason for purchasing outside of area is that we get households fleeing to us from within central Bedfordshire who are no longer safe in central Bedfordshire. So we have to house them outside of area. We also get prison releases and referrals from our MAPA colleagues of people who have criminal behaviour in their background where they've been released from prison, they need to be housed with their local authority. Bedfordshire Police are the ones that are supporting them, safety planning around them, but there's restrictions in place which mean they can't be housed in central Bedfordshire. We still have the duty to house them. So what we've done is we've found that if we just had 4 different flats and then the unit of 16, then we're able to accommodate them. Now within Luton, we have agreed with Luton Borough Council that that's a very short stay placement, and actually that's sort of larger accommodation. What we tend to do is if we have a household from Luton that approaches us for accommodation and they're reasonable preference and they're homeless, we will give them the TA within Luton because that makes sense to us. For the ones that are prison releases, we can't accommodate, we use those 1-bed flats that we've got dotted about, and they're not far. It's sort of Luton, Milton Keynes, Bedford. I think that's where our different TA is at the moment. So it's a way of us being able to make sure that we're not spending too much money on temporary accommodation because we own it and we manage it and we know it's good quality.